store,
Mm-hmm.
Publix, and there were just people yelling at them.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. No,
they can't control that.
Yeah, yeah.
If they're out, they're out there. They're doing the best they can.
Yeah, but yeah, people get mad at whoever's in front of them, and it's and it's not right. It's not fair. Okay, so for next time, we're going to be starting on C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, which is the third book in Lewis's Space Trilogy. But you don't really need to have read the other two books to understand what's going on in That Hideous Strength. Each of the three books kind of stands alone. However, those of you who are familiar with Lewis from the Narnia books, this is going to be a very different kind of reading experience, right? The Space Trilogy is written specifically with an adult audience in mind. So, yeah, this is not going. You're not going to be meeting friendly fawns hanging out under light poles. Father Christmas is not making an appearance.
Hey, no, Mr. Thomas.
I do want to remind everybody too that that you'll have your next vocabulary quiz this weekend, right? So you'll complete that Sunday by 11:59 p.m. Right? I'll send everybody a reminder also on Sunday so that everybody knows to finish it. So does anybody have any questions about anything before I get started? Or actually before we let Kathy get started, telling us about the culture that she has designed.
Okay, so can I start?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I wasn't sure if I was supposed to draw the people.
You absolutely, you certainly can.
Yeah, so I drew the people, but so for me, I call the civilian, like the society, they're called Woody Agilians. So that's how they look.
Okay.
And since it's like a humid and like warm climate during the summers and it's pretty mild during the winters, I figured that they wouldn't be as pale as we expect them to be, since like it's a very like high and like crops and everything. And so I named them, I made them tan and dark haired, and the clothes that they have is made from like the leaves of the birch trees that you can find in the plantasia.
Okay.
And the reason why I made it is because like these leaves, they can actually be used as emergency medicine for like infection or bone aches and stuff like that. So it's just like easy, like on the go. It's like it's like your mom having like Advil in her purse. And you can just like pull it off the clothes.
Just pull off your sleeve
You
if you
pull off
need
your
it.
sleeve and you can help others. And for the men's clothes, I made them have a sash only. This is always going to be hot, I figured, so the men wouldn't be really wearing clothes. They can wear like sashes because it's easier to move around. And the sashes has pockets that hold seeds to plants, but also has like a back that holds like a machete or axe to take down trees or crops and stuff like that.
Okay.
And then I call them as like a really peaceful community that mediates between the other communities, since like everyone's probably going to be friends with them because they have all these crops. They're really abundant in agriculture. And then I made them have like squiggly ears, like their ears are squiggly, rather than like the elfin kind of like pointed ears, they have squiggly ears. So it's like an extra sense that can tell them if there's someone that needs help or if there's someone in danger, like if there's danger around them and everything. So it's like a little spidey sense kind of thing. So I don't know, I thought that would be cool.
So the ear just kind of shoots out like a pigtail?
Yeah, it's just like, yeah, you can look at them. So that's how they look like. Yeah, he kind of looks like a genie.
He does.
And then even though they're a peaceful community, anything can happen. Like somebody might get jealous or something. So Woody Julians are taught self-defense from the age of 3 years old to 25.
Okay.
And then the animals, they are used as sacrifice every 3 months to keep the peace. And also, like, they don't let any of the animals go to waste. They're either to use as like weapons or like tools to use for their agriculture.
Okay.
Or like blankets from like the wool of the sheep and everything like that.
Okay.
And yeah, so So that's people.
So do they make most of their tools out of, like, say, like wood and bone
Yeah,
rather than
wooden
metal?
bones and stuff like that, or like yeah, it's mostly out of the bones of the animals.
Okay.
Because they're rather peaceful people, so
Mhm.
they don't want to like waste anything. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk then about Farmer Giles of Ham, which is one of Tolkien's lesser-known works. It's written in between the publication of The Hobbit in 1937 and the publication of The Lord of the Rings in 1954. Right, so I can't remember exactly when Farmer Giles of Ham is first published, but he's finished writing it around 1939. So what did y'all think of this?
Petty.
What's that?
Petty.
Okay.
That's
Why petty? What?
just the ending
Uh-huh.
with how Giles treats everybody who has been treating him, because
Uh-huh.
the king has made him famous
Sure.
for being a monster killer.
Uh-huh.
So that in turn requires him to act as a monster killer.
Okay.
Which puts him in so many dangerous situations. So by the end, he decides, okay, I'm taking all this guy's gold that he laid claim to that isn't necessarily his.
Uh-huh.
He is going to take away the business of the two people that have always been touting him
Uh-huh.
and give him like a little bit of penance
Uh-huh.
for their trouble.
Yeah.
And then builds a giant kingdom out of spite of the king.
Uh-huh. Well, does he build what is his kingdom called? What's it referred to as here? Originally, Ham is part of the Middle Kingdom. What does he
Little.
carve? Yeah, Giles's kingdom specifically is the Little Kingdom. And it seems to mostly arise by default, right? He just kind of stops acknowledging the king's authority and gathering followers to himself. And before anyone realizes it, the Little Kingdom is an independent entity, right? Broken off from the Middle Kingdom. And what is the king of the Middle Kingdom like? This guy, Augustus Bonifacius. Plus a bunch of other names.
Yeah. He's kind of like full of himself and greedy.
Okay.
He didn't much care for. He didn't really care about the village of Ham or really even Giles until
Mhm.
he got word of the dragon's treasure. Then he's like, "We're gonna go there."
Uh-huh.
And then he eats up all their food. He's like, "Oh, here's an IOU. Bring that to the exchequer."
Yeah.
Treasury's broke.
Yeah. Let's look there specifically. I think that is one of my favorite moments in the entire text. We look on page 162, right? The king did not go away. He pitched his pavilions in Farmer Giles's field and waited for January the 14th, making as merry as he could in a miserable village far from the capital. The royal retinue ate up nearly all the bread, butter, eggs, chickens, bacon, and mutton, and drank up every drop of old ale there was in the place in the next 3 days. Then they began to grumble at short commons. But the king paid handsomely for everything, in tallies to be honored later by the exchequer, which he hoped would shortly be richly replenished. So the folk of Ham were well satisfied, not knowing the actual state of the exchequer. So does the king actually have the money to pay for all this shit?
Nope.
Yeah. He's essentially written them a bad check, right? He and his retinue have eaten up all of their food, have been occupying their useful farmland with their pavilions, and have given them, as you said, kind of an IOU, right, to be drawn on an entity that the king knows to be currently more or less bankrupt. So yeah, so I think, we have a king, right, this Augustus Bonifacius, whose name, by the way, translates to something like George Goodfate. Who was actually rich only in titles, right? If we look on page 136, it gives the king's full name and titles, right? Ego Augustus Bonifacius Ambrosius Aurelianus Antoninus Pius et Magnificus Dux Rex Tyrannus et Basilius Mediterranean part Mediterranean Partium Subscribo. So I, George Goodfate, Ambrosius Aurelianus, Antoninus Pius, and the Great, Duke, King, right? King in Latin and King in Greek, and Emperor of the Middle Kingdom. Sign. Right? So here's a guy who's a king of a paltry little territory in a backwater of the Roman Empire, who gives himself all of these elaborate titles. Right? So what Farmer Giles of Ham is, at least in part, is a kind of mock history. Or pseudo-history. Which is itself a genre with a long pedigree. And the foreword to Farmer Giles of Ham actually kind of sets this up for us. If we look on page 123, can I get somebody to start reading this for us? Starting with the history of the Little Kingdom.
Of the history of the Little Kingdom, few fragments have survived, but by chance an account of its origin has been preserved. A legend, perhaps, but rather than an account, for it is evidently a late compilation full of marvels derived not from sober annals, but from the popular lays of which its author frequently refers. For him, the events that he records lay already in a distant past, but he seems nonetheless to have lived himself in the lands of the Little Kingdom. Such geographical knowledge as he knows is not his strong point, is of that country, while of regions outside it, north or west, he is plainly ignorant.
Okay, so first off, let's look at what this says about the Little Kingdom itself, right? And how the author of this foreword, right, can tell that this little history, this little vignette, was written by someone from the Little Kingdom, right? What are his clues that this is by someone from the Little Kingdom?
Derived not from sober annals, but from popular lays to which its author frequently refers.
Okay, so he's arguing that this is taken from popular rather than scholarly sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But again, why does he think this was written by someone from the Little Kingdom?
He only has knowledge of that country, not of the other regions.
Yeah, That's the big kicker, right? Is that whoever wrote this seems to be completely ignorant of the world outside of this little small parcel of land, right? Can I get somebody to continue with an excuse for presenting a translation of this curious tale?
An excuse for presenting a translation of this curious tale out of its very insular Latin into the modern tongue of the United Kingdom may be found in a glimpse that it affords of light in a dark period of the history of Britain, not to mention the light that it throws on the origin of some difficult place names. Some may find the character and adventures of its hero attractive in themselves. The boundaries of the little kingdom, either in time or space, are not easy to determine from the scanty evidence. Since Brutus came to Britain, many kings and realms have come and gone. The partition under Lochran, Camer, and Albinat was only the first of many shifting divisions. What with the love of petty independence on the one hand, and on the other the greed of kings for wider realms, the years were filled with swift alterations of war and peace, of mirth and woe, as historians of the reign of Arthur tell us. A time of unsettled frontiers when men might rise or fall suddenly, and songwriters had abundant material and eager audiences. Somewhere in those long years, after the days of King Cole, maybe, but before Arthur or the 7 kingdoms of English, we must place the events here related. And their scene is the valley of the Thames, with an excursion northwest to the walls of Wales.
Okay, thank you. So, I want to point here to the first paragraph that Ashlyn just read for us, and the fact that this particular history that the scholar here claims to be translating is written in very insular Latin, right? What does the word insular mean? What does insular literally mean or literally refer to? Okay, what's a peninsula?
It's a landmass with 3 coasts.
Yeah, it's surrounded on 3 sides by water, right? So if you take away the pen and you just have an insula, you have...
An enclosed land. Sorry.
I think... So yeah, what do we call land that's enclosed on 4 sides by water?
An island?
Yeah, exactly. Insular means island, right? So insular island, like insular Latin here literally means like basically, British Isles Latin, right? So Latin of the island. But what else can insular mean?
Isolated?
Yeah. Someone or something that is insular is kind of isolated, self-contained, right? So we're getting a kind of sense here of the little kingdom as a place that is cut off from the rest of the world, right? Or not interested in the rest of the world. Now, in that second paragraph that Ashlyn read for us, we have these figures, Brutus, Arthur, and King Cole. What do we know, if anything, about these figures? I think we've mentioned at least some of them before.
Brutus is, I believe, the son of Aeneas.
Yeah, he's a descendant of Aeneas, yeah.
And Aeneas, or the legend says that Aeneas went from Rome whenever it fell and went to the British Isles to rule, and thus Brutus came down, giving the British Isles a Roman lineage.
Yeah, so that is almost exactly the story. So Aeneas goes and founds Rome from Troy. He escapes the fall of Troy, goes and founds Rome. And Brutus, another Trojan survivor, goes in a different direction and comes to Britain, thus giving it its name, right? So yeah, but yeah, the basic idea is correct there. Yeah, that you're giving this kind of classical mythological lineage to the British, right? To the native British. And what about Arthur? Who's Arthur?
Legendary king of Camelot.
Yeah. And what's the key word in your description there?
Legend.
Legendary, yes. Not historical. Right, King Cole, we know is a figure from nursery rhymes, right? You know, old King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he. Right, really? That's not ringing a bell for anybody?
We had different
Wow.
nursery rhymes.
I guess, wow. But King Cole is also this kind of semi-mythological early king of Britain, right? We say semi-mythological because, again, like we're not sure of the exact historicity of some of these figures. But right, what all three of these have in common is that they're on some level not real, right? They're not real, verifiable historical figures. And yet, the scholar who writes this introduction is treating them as though they are. Right? Hence, right, pseudo-history, false history. Now, the other thing that these three figures have in common is that they all figure prominently in one of the most famous medieval books of pseudo-history. It's a book by a Welsh monk named Geoffrey of Monmouth called Historiam Regum Britanniae, or in English, History of the Kings of Britain. And this was published, or not published, there was no means of like real publication, it was written, completed, somewhere around the year 1136. And we know that this book was extremely popular in the Middle Ages because there are a number of surviving manuscript copies, and Geoffrey's influence seems to be very, very keenly felt in subsequent King Arthur narratives especially. Many of which even kind of start with the story of Brutus, right? So any of you who've read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight before, right? It begins with that narrative of Brutus coming to Britain to found a new kingdom, right? So what Tolkien is doing here in this little scholarly preface is imitating the style and content of Geoffrey of Monmouth and situating this in the genre of medieval pseudo-history. So, one of the things that he does note is real history. He talks about this being sort of between King Cole, historically, and Arthur, and the seven kingdoms of the English. So he's referring to the period after the Romans left Britain, and the kingdom was divided up into seven Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, right? Wessex, Essex, Sussex, right? West Saxons, East Saxons, South Saxons, Northumbria, Mercia in the middle of the country, Kent in the southeast, and Anglia, right, land of the Angles. So these are real, historically verifiable kingdoms, right? But these arise later than the period that is being discussed in Farmer Giles of Ham, or that's being kind of mocked and parodied in Farmer Giles of Ham. Right? The date for what's happening in Farmer Giles of Ham would be sort of somewhere between around the years 300 and 450. And the other thing I want to go back to here is at the end of that first paragraph that Ashlyn read for us. Right, an excuse for presenting a translation of this curious tale out of its very insular Latin into the modern tongue of the United Kingdom may be found in the glimpse that it affords of life in a dark period of the history of Britain, not to mention the light it throws on the origin of some difficult place names. Some may find the character and adventures of its hero attractive in themselves. So what is this scholar writing the introduction arguing the primary interest in this tale should be? How does he think this tale is important or useful?
The names of places?
Yeah. Origin of place names, history of Britain, right? So he is situating this as being of scholarly and historical interest, right? Right, particularly when we're talking about history and language. And the idea that anyone might enjoy the story is kind of an afterthought, right? Now, one thing to note here is that the whole story is on some level satirical, right? And so is this foreword. So Tolkien himself, does anybody know or remember what Tolkien actually did for a living?
He was a professor.
Yeah. Professor of what specifically?
Anglo-Saxon?
Language.
Yeah, he's a specialist in Anglo-Saxon language, right? Yeah, but he was, professionally speaking, a philologist, right? So yeah, he was a specialist in language and literature with a particular focus on language. So, in a way, what he's doing here is mocking some of the tendencies of his own profession, right? That this story is useful because it tells us a lot about the origins of place names in a certain part of England. Oh, and yeah, you might find the personality of the hero in some of his adventures amusing as well, right? Good for you if you do. But it's important also that he points out what the sources of the story are for whatever scholar of the Middle Kingdom wrote it. That it's coming from popular lays and ballads, right? Which again makes this narrative a lot like Geoffrey of Monmouth's. Right? Geoffrey wrote his history primarily by compiling folk stories, right? Things that were passed down in oral tradition, rather than from looking at scholarly chronicles. He also embellished a lot with his own imagination, right? Geoffrey had a marked propensity for just making shit up when he didn't have a logical way to connect two stories to each other. But yeah, so this is like history as a kind of work of imagination. All right, so we talked a little bit here about the king, right? Let's talk a little bit about his counterpart in the narrative, Farmer Giles himself. What is Farmer Giles like?
He's an old farmer. He wants nothing but that.
Overweight.
Usually.
Yeah, he's an old farmer. He's a little overweight. Okay.
Who wants nothing more than to like keep all of his riches like to himself.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe not the most generous, right? Although there is a kind of justice in his not taking the dragon's treasure to the king, right? And he does also let Chrysophlax hold on to some small portion of his treasure, right? He knows the dragon is holding some back, but doesn't make him give it all up. How else is he different from, say, the king and the court? What's his personality like?
He's very, leave me alone, I have things to do. And
Okay.
he just wants to party.
Okay. Yeah, so Farmer Giles is actually busy with farming, right? And his first act of heroism, right, driving away the giants, is motivated by that threat to his farm and his property, right? You know, the giant has stepped on and crushed his best cow and is just kind of walking around the village, stepping on things, right? So Giles goes after him with a blunderbuss. Now, do we think of this as a particularly heroic or knightly weapon? It's also a total historical anachronism, right? This is a gunpowder weapon being used in the 4th or early 5th century, right?
Yeah.
When there were no such weapons in Europe.
Wait, so blunderbuss is a weapon?
Yeah, blunderbuss is. Does anybody know what a blunderbuss is? Did anybody know what a blunderbuss was before?
It's like an old-timey shotgun.
Yeah, it is kind of like an old. Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. It's an old-timey shotgun, right? So it's a gun with a longish barrel and a kind of wide mouth, and you just stuff whatever you can into it. And when you pull the trigger, if the gun doesn't blow up, it fires all of those things at whatever you point it at, right?
It's like grape
Handheld.
shot. by hand.
Yeah, that's yeah.
Handheld cannon.
It is kind of like a handheld cannon, yeah, right. But one that you can stuff anything into it. In fact, there's a good bit in here about they're quibbling over the definition of blunderbuss here, right? If we turn to page 130. Can I get somebody to read for us, starting with the last paragraph here? Still, property is property.
Still, property is property, and Farmer Giles had a short way with trespassers that few could outface. So he pulled up on his breeches and went down into the kitchen and took his blunderbuss from the wall. Some may well ask what a blunderbuss was. Indeed, this very question, it is said, was put to the 4 wise clerks of Oxenford, and after thought they replied, a blunderbuss is a short gun with a large bore, firing many balls or slugs, and capable of doing execution within a limited range without exact aim. Now superseded in civilized countries by other firearms.
Okay, so these 4 wise clerks of Oxenford, what this definition is that Tolkien is using is taken directly from the OED, right, the Oxford English Dictionary, which he himself early in his career as a scholar had worked on. I forget which letter he was particularly responsible for, but he himself, came up with several of the definitions and traced the origins of several words, right, as a kind of like scholarly project before he got his first professorial job, right? So these 4 wise clerks of Oxenford would be the editors of the OED, right? Oxenford being an archaic name for Oxford.
Oxenford.
Oxenford, yes. So I'd like to look now at the way the narrator critiques this definition in the following paragraph, right? However, Farmer Giles's blunderbuss had a wide mouth that opened like a horn, and it did not fire balls or slugs, but anything that he could spare to stuff in. And it did not do execution, because he seldom loaded it and never let it off. The sight of it was usually enough for his purpose. And this country was not yet civilized, for the blunderbuss was not superseded. It was indeed the only kind of gun that there was, and rare at that. People preferred bows and arrows and used gunpowder mostly for fireworks. Right? Again, historically, no one was using gunpowder in Europe for anything in the 5th century. Right? Gunpowder was known in Asia, but not in Europe. But this kind of anachronism is actually really common in chivalric romance, right? We know, for example, that if there was a historical King Arthur, he would have been a 6th century Romanized Celtic warlord, right? Not a knight in plate armor riding around on a charger. So, what we're getting here is something like the way the authors of chivalric romance tend to look back on history or pseudo-history and read it in light of their own present. Right, so the blunderbuss, the addition of the blunderbuss, if we're looking at this as a mock scholarly text, is meant to point us to the author of this having lived a good deal after the events described and reading things that might have been common in his own time onto Giles's. But I think that the other thing to note here in this too is, like, what is it that the 4 wise clerks of Oxenford say about what kinds of countries the blunderbuss is still used in?
Primitive ones, or
Yeah, now superseded in civilized countries by other firearms, right? So if people are still using a blunderbuss, they must be,
yeah, they're just using longer action rifles and Roman as
oh, totally.
In the Byzantine Empire too.
Yeah. Well, you know, the Byzantine Empire did have certain chemical flammable weapons. I think there was something they used called Greek fire that we've not actually been able to chemically reproduce.
Yeah, it's fun to watch. Because it'll just burn.
But yeah, so the suggestion here is that at least on some level, Giles and his neighbors are primitive, right? And I think it would probably behoove us to question the way the story defines what is or isn't primitive. And I think we can maybe do that by comparing them to the quote-unquote civilized people in the story. So what is it that King Augustus Bonifacius Ambrosius Aurelianus Antoninus Pius et Magnificus sends to Giles as a reward for dispatching the giant?
An old sword.
Yeah,
Nobody knows anything about.
he sends him, this old sword nobody knows anything about, right?
Yeah, heavy swords of that kind were out of fashion at court just then.
Mhm.
So the king thought it a very thing for a present to a rustic.
Yeah. So he sends him this thing, right? Because he's like, oh, like this sort of thing is unfashionable here, but a country bumpkin out in the village of Ham would love this, right? I'll send him this sword as a prize. I'm not using it anyway. Right? Now, does this king, by the way, seem like he has ever used any sword?
No.
Probably not, right? There's very little that is heroic about Augustus Bonifacius or about anyone in his court, right?
I pick up a sword and you have knights.
Yeah, and do the knights even pick up their swords?
No, they're kind of just like figureheads.
Yeah, the knights are pretty fucking useless too, right? If we look on page 137 here, right, below the passage about the sword, right? In those days, dragons were already getting scarce in the island. None had been seen in the midland realm of Augustus Bonifacius for many a year. There were, of course, the dubious marches and the uninhabited mountains westward and northward, but they were a long way off. In those parts, once upon a time, there had dwelt a number of dragons of one kind and another, and they had made raids far and wide. But the Middle Kingdom was in those days, right, not now, famous for the daring of the king's knights, since so many stray dragons had been killed or had returned with grave damage that the others gave up going that way. It was still the custom for dragon's tail to be served up at the king's Christmas feast. And each year, a knight was chosen for the duty of hunting. He was supposed to set out upon St. Nicholas Day and come home with a dragon's tail not later than the eve of the feast. But for many years now, the royal cook had made a marvelous confection, a mock dragon's tail of cake and almond paste with cunning scales of hard icing sugar. The chosen knight then carried this into the hall on Christmas Eve while the fiddles played and the trumpets rang. The mock dragon's tail was eaten after dinner on Christmas Day, and everybody said, to please the cook, that it tasted much better than real tail. So how has this court kind of degenerated over the passage of time?
For one thing, they're bending head over heels for the cook. For
Okay.
some reason throughout the entire novella.
Yeah, the cook seems to be more important than the knights, right? All the knights seem to be afraid of upsetting the cook.
Well, I mean, that's the person that makes sure you're fed,
Oh, sure.
you know?
Uh-huh.
He's the only one with an important job at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, do the knights actually do anything?
No.
One of them gets selected every year now to bring in the mock dragon's tail, right? So instead of having a real tail cut from a real dragon after a real fight, right, they're just eating fancy cake.
They become more like dandy.
Uh-huh.
Like, it even says like before the knights actually like went and slayed a dragon, well not challenged the dragon, they cut off its tail.
Uh-huh.
And that was roasted, like that was prepared and served. And
Yeah.
now it's like, well, there's not many dragons, but let's just make a really pretty cake.
Yeah, and the cook is the only one who does any real work there now, right? I think, by the way, that this might be the word you were looking for. Yeah, decadent, right? This notion of having fallen far, right, from some previous ideal state. So, in the past, the knights were heroic warriors who went out and hunted dragons and giants. And now, they mostly kind of sit around eating and drinking. Now, does this look familiar to any of you from depictions we've seen of King Arthur and his court?
His court in the story of the Grail.
Yeah, I mean, with the exception of Percival and Gawain, right? Those guys are mostly pretty useless. They sit around not doing a whole lot, right? The king lets the Red Knight ride in, steal a cup, and insult him without doing anything about it. None of the knights lift a finger to do anything about it, right? And the only one who does anything at all is this little, this rustic kid on a hunting horse with javelins and a leather jerkin who doesn't know any better, right? And I think that Giles is in some ways a little bit similar to Percival as a kind of accidental hero, right? Or that at least in this terms of like this kind of, rustic figure who becomes a knight. Now, Percival does so quite intentionally, right? And, is trying to live up to what he believes the ideals of knighthood should be, depending on who the last person who taught him anything was. But Farmer Giles seems to be more just kind of figuring it all out as he goes along, right? And he acquires these kinds of old-fashioned trappings of knighthood almost gradually, right? So, first, his initial heroic deed, against, with a blunderbuss, right? We don't think of knights wielding guns or of, firing a shotgun at a giant as being particularly courageous or heroic, especially given, the circumstances, right? Giles, fires the gun and is knocked on his ass by the recoil, right? And it doesn't even really hurt the giant. He just he thinks it's horseflies, and he decides he better go back home. But from that point, right, after that initial deed with an unknightly weapon, rather like Percival's killing of the Red Knight with his javelins, he then starts acquiring knightly goods, right? He gets a sword, right? And not just a sword, but apparently a magic dragon slaying sword, right? Called a morax, or in English, tailbiter. And note that, whenever it's translating something from Latin into English, right?
It's vulgar language.
The vulgar language, yes. Now, this doesn't mean vulgar the way we usually mean vulgar, right? Vulgar is derived, the word vulgar is derived from a Latin word that means kind of common or peasant, right? So vulgar language would be the language of the common people. This, by the way, is actually why we call, certain words vulgar, right? For example, is there anything really much different, in terms of meaning, if I say bowel movement or if I say shit? They mean the same thing, right? So why do why is shit considered a vulgar word?
It's used in more vulgar tongue. It's used by the common people. It's used more in less formal conversation.
Yeah, it's used in less formal conversation, right? And it refers directly to the thing itself rather than being a polite euphemism. But this actually also kind of comes from the history of language, right? Shit is one of the oldest words in the English language. It comes direct to us from Anglo-Saxon, more or less unchanged. And after 1066, when the Normans invaded Britain, French became the language of polite society and of the court. So we still see that, most of our, fashion words, a lot of our legal terms, a lot of our cooking terms, military terms, a lot of things that refer to elite culture, or what would have been elite culture in the Middle Ages, are derived from French. Whereas a lot of our, words for common everyday things, and most of the words we consider impolite, are from Anglo-Saxon. They wouldn't have been considered impolite by the original Anglo-Saxon speakers. But because those people become the peasants when the Normans take over, their words for certain things become vulgar, right? Become regarded as impolite. And I figure that, since Tolkien was a philologist, and so much of what's going on here is, jokes about language and philology, this little detour is actually kind of relevant. especially given all the jokes that he makes about the vulgar tongue, right? So after acquiring his sword, Caudamorax, what's the next piece of knightly equipment that Giles manages to get?
He gets, what's the right word? Not haphazard, what's the word for it? A haphazardly made set of armor, set of mail.
Yeah, not yet made by the village blacksmith, right? Not, by the by some fancy city armorer, right? The regular village blacksmith, who's more accustomed to making horseshoes and farming implements, makes for him a suit of ringmail, right? Which, compared to the polished armor of the knights of the court, would be extremely archaic, right? So ringmail is basically just iron rings that are sewn into a leather jacket. So, as far as armor goes, pretty primitive. And also not especially effective. But yeah, when Giles appears among the knights of the court, in his ringmail, right, on page 162, right, January the 14th came, the feast of Hilarius and of Felix, and everybody was up and about early. The knights put on their armor. The farmer put on his coat of homemade mail, and they smiled openly until they caught the king's frown. So the knights want to, he doesn't fit in with the knights here. They're wearing armor, he's wearing armor, but theirs is fancy and polished, and his is homemade and rustic. I think if we look further up the page as well, we see a good indication of the court's values here. Right, where the king is talking to Farmer Giles, laying claim to the treasure for himself, right? He says, "We make no doubt in any case," said he, "that all the treasure of this worm was stolen from our ancestors. Yet we are, as all know, both just and generous, and our good liege Aegidius shall be suitably rewarded. Nor shall any of our loyal subjects in this place go without some token of our esteem, from the parson to the youngest child, for we are well pleased with Ham. Here at least a sturdy and uncorrupted folk still retain the ancient courage of our race." So, first thing to note here is that the king is speaking this kind of essentialist and condescending discourse about rural people, right? That rural people are somehow pure and uncorrupted examples from an earlier time, right? How pleasant to meet you, you bunch of throwbacks. And then at the same time that he mentions the sturdy, uncorrupted folk with their ancient courage, the knights were talking among themselves about the new fashion in hats. So the thing that the king says that seems to be meant to be almost kind of condescending, right, actually ends up also being kind of true when you compare it to the behavior of his court, right? That the knights repeatedly show themselves to be cowardly and trivial. And how does the king behave when the dragon doesn't show up?
It's their fault, more specifically Giles' fault.
Yeah. Now, it is kind of their fault for trusting the dragon, right? For trusting that he was just going to show up and bring his treasure, right? And, they did seem to ask for a rather excessive amount from him. Right, if we look on page 164 at the bottom of the page, but the next day passed and the next. Then they all gave up hope. The king was in a red rage. The victuals and drink had run out, and the knights were grumbling loudly. They wished to go back to the merriments of court, but the king wanted money. He took leave of his loyal subjects, but he was short and sharp about it, and he canceled half the tallies on the exchequer. He was quite cold to Farmer Giles and dismissed him with a nod. "You will hear from us later," he said, and rode off with his knights and trumpeters. So he's so angry, he's in such a snit about the dragon not showing up, that he decides he's not going to pay the bills he's run up from the villagers, the bills that he can't pay anyway, right? Unbeknownst to them, right? That he certainly can't pay without the dragon's treasure. I think it is also, there's one more thing I want to note about the behavior of the knights here before we see how they,
when Giles finally shows up and they take the king at his word, like as soon as he shows up, they leave out.
uh-huh,
Like they don't even give him a chance to get a sip of wine.
yeah, they don't give him any chance to rest. Yeah, they're annoyed at having to wait for this guy. And so they just march out kind of impolitely. Because he's just a commoner anyway, right?
Yeah.
But I also want to look at, on page 143, at the excuse the knights make for not going out and hunting the dragon, right? But Christmas had arrived, and most unfortunately, a grand tournament had been arranged for St. John's Day. Knights of many realms had been invited and were coming to compete for a valuable prize. It was obviously unreasonable to spoil the chances of the Midland Knights by sending their best men off on a dragon hunt before the tournament was over. So why can't these guys go dragon hunting?
Oh, they got to fight in the tournament.
Yeah.
They have to go joust.
Yeah, the tournament is their excuse, right? And how is a tournament different from a dragon fight?
Less likely to die of fiery death.
Yes, certainly.
There are more rules.
Yeah. Yeah, there are rules in a tournament, right? Because a tournament is essentially what?
The game.
Yeah, it's a sport, it's a game, right? Yeah, they're resisting going off for a real fight with a real dragon to stay home and play fight, right?
But I thought tournaments they can actually die.
I mean, you can.
Yeah.
But that's like the lance has to land exactly right, like nook in your armor.
Yeah.
Hits you just right.
People did sometimes die in tournaments, but it was relatively infrequent. And one thing to remember, actually, that even in battle, right, it was relatively rare for knights to kill each other, in part because whichever side you were fighting on, odds are you were related to most of the knights on the other side. Plus, if you captured one of them, you could keep his stuff and hold him for ransom, so that his family would have to give you money to get him back, right? So it was generally more profitable if you were a knight to try to capture other knights rather than kill them. Plus, you didn't necessarily want to, go chopping the head off of your, second cousin once removed, right?
You're more likely to die from infection than you were in actual fight.
Exactly, yeah. Right, because no penicillin.
No, really
Yeah.
any. thing.
But I think also, like, the tournament here is definitely presented also, both as a play fight and as an excuse, right? That this is why the knights can't go off and do something genuinely useful, because they have to, they have to be ready to show off their prowess in this tournament. And then how do things go when they do get a chance
Terribly.
for a real fight? Yeah.
Bottoms up, essentially.
Uh-huh. For one thing, they have no clue what they're doing, right? They have no understanding of the situation they're in. If we look on page 167, just below this illustration of, the knights riding out proudly on their horses, right? It was already late in the day, too late in the day to start a dragon hunt, thought Giles. But they did not go far. The knights were in no hurry once they had started. They rode along at their leisure in a straggling line, knights, esquires, servants, and ponies trussed with baggage, and Farmer Giles jogging behind on his tired mare. So, not only are they not going very fast, right? They're in no hurry to go meet the dragon. They've also got this massive entourage with them. And they're carrying all this shit that they probably don't need to fight a dragon, right? When evening came, they halted and pitched their tents. No provision had been made for Farmer Giles, and he had to borrow what he could. The mare was indignant, and she forswore her allegiance to the house of Augustus Bonifacius. The next day they rode on, and all the day after. On the third day they descried in the distance the dim and inhospitable mountains. Before long they were in regions where the lordship of Augustus Bonifacius was not universally acknowledged. They rode then with more care and kept closer together, right? When they're still close to home, they know people have to respect them. Once they leave the lands ruled by their king, it's anything goes. On the fourth day, they reached the wild hills and the borders of the dubious lands where legendary creatures were reputed to dwell. Suddenly, one of those riding ahead came upon ominous footprints in the sand by a stream. They called for the farmer. "What are these, Master Egidius?" they said. "Dragon marks," said he. "Lead on," said they. So, where he's been riding in the back trying to keep up with them, now, once they see the dragon marks, he has to go in front, right?
Yeah.
You go first. So they rode west with Farmer Giles at their head, and all the rings were jingling on his leather coat. That mattered little, for all the knights were laughing and talking, and a minstrel rode with them singing a lay. Every now and again they took up the refrain of the song and sang it all together, very loud and strong. It was encouraging, for the song was good. It had been made long before in days when battles were more common than tournaments, but it was unwise. Their coming was now known to all the creatures of that land, and the dragons were cocking their ears in all the caves of the west. There was no longer any chance of their catching old Chrysophlax napping. And I read this, and it keeps making me think of the scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where brave Sir Robin's minstrels are singing the song about how brave Sir Robin ran away. Bravely ran away, away. When danger reared its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled. Which is exactly what these knights do when faced with the actual dragon, right? Those that aren't immediately roasted alive. So the basic point of all this seems to be that these stories of knightly adventure are total bullshit, right? Particularly in this apparently decadent age, when there's been this massive separation between the culture of the court and the culture of the village, right? That the court has become weak and decadent and overly reliant on and also it's also broke, right?
Yeah.
Which is why the king is so deeply interested in getting the dragon's treasure, because You know, they live this way, you know, as kind of parasites on the land without actually,
Contributing.
yeah, without contributing anything or having any real way to make money, right? They just keep exhausting the resources of the kingdom. So the dragon would have given them a good bit of a start, right? On making up some of that. There is one thing that we haven't really talked about here, and that's the role of these talking animals, especially the dog, Garm. And what did you think of the way the dog is depicted here? I mean, I guess like I asked this mostly just because I have a deep and abiding interest in dogs.
I feel bad for Garm. Poor thing.
Okay.
He's like his master is both terrible and splendid.
Uh-huh.
And then he doesn't know, like he knows he should just obey him, but at the same time, like, why am I getting hit and things thrown at me? And like he also, I mean, find where it is.
Yeah, Giles certainly does not treat his dog the way I treat my dog.
Oh, really? Like it says, Garm on 126. Garm could not talk even dog Latin, but he could use the vulgar tongue, as could most dogs of his day, either to bully or to brag or to wheedle in. Bullying was for beggars and trespassers, bragging for other dogs, and wheedling for his master. Garm was both proud and afraid of Giles, who could bully and brag better than he could. So it's like he recognizes his place in like the hierarchy of that house. But then he's like, I'm proud of Giles, but I'm also terrified of him.
Yeah. And I think that there's a language joke in here as well, too, that Garm cannot even speak dog Latin. So, dog Latin is a kind of language game in which you take English words and make them sound like Latin words, right? So you gotta like make fake Latin out of English. So I'm trying to think of an example.
Is there any Pig Latin?
Like Pig Latin, like itape.
Now, Pig Latin is a little different because Pig Latin is more like a way of kind of like saying things in code. Dog Latin is a way of just kind of dressing up English in a way that just kind of sounds funny, right? What is the... there's the song of the Sword and the Stone that Merlin sings. That is, most of it is in dog Latin. So like, you know, there's a word he uses, prestidigitonium.
Yeah.
Which is just, you know, prestidigitation with a Latin suffix at the end of it, right? Prestidigitonium. So that whole song is, for the most part, dog Latin. So if you go back and kind of watch that movie and you watch him kind of waving his wand and packing up his bag and all that. That's an example of what dog Latin is. But yeah, here the joke is that the dog can't even speak dog Latin, right? He can only speak in the vulgar tongue. And he respects Giles, who can bully and brag better than he can. And I think that part of what's happening too is we see the way hierarchy works in a quote-unquote less civilized society, right? Hierarchy in the court is based on prestige, right? Giles's authority isn't really based on much that's any better, right? Giles's prestige is based on how well he can push other people around. And so it's not really much of a surprise when he becomes a king with his own with his own followers at the end of the story, right? And he carves out his own little independent nation where he can, bully and brag. Because let's be honest, most royal lines probably start with somebody who's very good at bullying and bragging, right? Okay, so we're about out of time, so let me give you the reading questions for that hideous strength. And yep, again, just remember, no fawns, no Father Christmas, no Jesus allegory lion in this one. Although it is animated ultimately by some of the same religious concerns as the Narnia books.